Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley, managing partner at Oxbow. And I have, I would say one of my favorite, but it's probably my favorite person in economics that I have here today. And I'm always blessed to have him because I think he's the best in the country, and that's Dr. Lacy Hunt. Lacy, glad to have you.
I'm glad for you to have me. It's that kind of you.
Yeah, I'm
You're the
gonna,
best. You're the best, Ted.
I'm
Too
gonna,
kind.
I'm gonna start out. You've written recently about, I don't know, 7 or 8 things that you thought that would push the disinflationary or lower inflation through 26. And I was wondering if you might talk about, if you don't want to talk about all of them, but maybe talk about a few of them.
Well, I think the most important is the fact that the labor markets are so fragile. Um, the Bureau of Labor Statistics we've seen really unprecedented bureaucratic failure in the job count going on now for more than 3 years. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics overcounted in 2025 by a million after a half a million overcount in 2024 and a sizable but slightly smaller overcount in 2023. And as a result, we only had about 10,000 new jobs a month last year. And that was all more than accounted for by social service and medical, which is tied to the aging demographic. You can't run an economy
Yeah. And
with
you
such
had
pathetic numbers.
you talked a lot about how the PCE, the personal consumption expenditure index was coming down while the also compensation was coming down, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you remember, and that's one of the critical points is that we had disinflation last year. In other words, the rate of inflation fell, but the rate of increase in compensation, wage and salaries, including benefits, slowed even more dramatically. And so the real purchasing power of our households actually fell. In fact, if you look at total personal income adjusted for taxes and inflation, it's declined for the last 6 months. And that's true either if you exclude or include the governmental transfer payments. And the consumer has been spending at a 3% rate, but they're spending with fumes, and they've had to draw the saving rate down to about 2/3%, which, with the exception of a little brief period during COVID, is the lowest since 2006. Our consumers are in distress, and the one of the real fundamental problems is that the inflation rate has been creeping a little bit lower, but there were such gigantic increases in so many things during COVID, particularly for the big ticket items, housing, cars, a host of other things. And they're out of the reach of a majority of our people.
And
And that's not a healthy situation.
you also, I think you think that monetary conditions were restrictive, if I hear you right,
I
last
do
year.
believe that.
And it's
I know
interesting.
that's a very contrary view.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Everybody thought since they lowered rates, hey, it's got to be looser now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, we've had 175 basis points of reductions in the federal funds rate, and but there's been very little benefit to your small businesses and your consumers, and the banks have been increasing loans, but all of the increase after inflation went into loans to non-depository financial institutions. It didn't go to consumers, small businesses. It went to these private credit, private equity firms that take the bank funds that they borrow and then leverage them further. And so one of the real problems for monetary policy is that I'm not sure that the Fed knows or anyone knows how reductions in the federal funds rate are actually going to increase the flow of funds into the household and the consumer sector at a time when we're seeing massive increases in consumer loan delinquencies across the board. We're seeing increased bankruptcies. And so a monetary policy is not working. It works. It works for the very top tier very well, perhaps too well, but it's not there for the consumer or for the household sector.
You'd think, Lacy, Federal Reserve with what, 400 PhDs could figure that out a little bit.
Yeah, you would. That's interesting that you would reference that. Everyone knows that the Fed's the central bank of the U.S. and probably the world, but the problem is that they're also the most expensive economic research organization in the world.
That's interesting. I don't doubt it, but it's interesting.
And so the question is, well, why aren't they doing a better job? And I think the problem is that while they have all of this talent and they have broad diversification in gender and ethnicity and everything else, but they don't have diversification in economic thought. They're virtually all neo-Keynesians, no neoclassical economists to speak of, and that's not healthy. But help is on the way because Kevin Warsh, who was trained at Stanford University in the late 80s and early 90s, was there when it was a bastion of neoclassical power. John Taylor, the Taylor Rule was there. Roland McKinnon, the great international economist, was there. Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate, who actually wrote a book with Kevin Warsh, and Edward Rozier was there. Milton Friedman was at the Hoover Institute.
I never knew that.
And Warsh attended many of those great lectures. Friedman would pack the lecture halls.
Yeah.
And Warsh believes that, as neoclassicals do, that it's government policy failure at the Federal Reserve and federal level, oftentimes when they combine, and he wants to change that system, as he told CNBC in an interview last year. It's a regime change is needed, and a regime change is coming, but we have to wait until May.
You think they have the wherewithal to do it?
I think they do. I think that I think it can be changed. It's going to be difficult, but I think the economy will be better off for it when it happens. The book that Warsh wrote with Spence is really a very scholarly article, and it goes into how forward guidance and quantitative easing have damaged economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's contrary to the current view, because we've seen them come in and stabilize markets when they were in decline, and people think, well, gee whiz, it worked. Unfortunately, the point that they're making is that when the Fed does that, it gives the managers, the corporate managers, wealth managers, and so forth, the signal that the Fed is willing to protect financial assets, their price, and their liquidity.
Yeah.
And that makes financial investing more suitable to them and less risky than investing in plant equipment and hard assets.
So true.
And so we shift the share of assets into financial rather than real investments, and that undermines the real economic growth rate, which is dropped from to close to 2.5% down to 1.2% per annum. That's not good for 75-80% of our people.
That is so true, Lacy. You hear that term financial engineering, and
yes,
that's the last 15 years. That's really what we've had.
It's coming to an end.
Yeah.
It's coming to an end, and I think you're going to see dramatic changes. I wouldn't
So
be surprised.
I was going to ask you too. I know now this was prior to the Supreme Court last week, but I know earlier I think you felt like that tariffs eventually drive up prices, but in the long run, they cause disinflation because you drop demand off. Now, what do you think the outcome will be now?
Well, of course, it's very muddled, but let me just talk about it for a minute. So, um, when you impose tariffs, it shifts the supply curve inward. So your demand and supply give you higher prices. Unfortunately, the higher prices shrink corporate profit margins, so they have to have a second round price increase. Um, and you also get a number of other third and fourth round increases that are contractionary. And that process is actually working out. If you look at the trade deficit, excluding the first quarter, when people rushed in to buy in advance, um, our trade deficit shrunk very dramatically in the second, third, and fourth quarters. And Christine Lagarde gave a speech yesterday to the European partner, European Parliament, in which she highlighted the problem of exporters in Europe. And so you have a secondary round effect. So and there was a great study done last year at the San Francisco Fed that shows that initially tariffs are inflationary, but ultimately disinflationary because of the demand effects. Now it looks like, and I think it's very likely, that the tariff rate for 2025 and 2026, I mean, for 2026 and 2027 and thereafter, is going to be lower than what it would have been before the Supreme Court ruled. So we were running, the tariff rate was running about 10.5% of goods imports into the U.S. The president has reimposed a tariff for 15% to replace the ones that were declared constitutionally illegal, but they expire in 150 days. And after the 150 days, he's going to have to use a different section of the 1974 law, and in which he justifies it case by case by case in a very complicated process. And so I would say instead of having a tariff rate of 10.5%, we're going to have a tariff rate of 9%, maybe at the output, 9.5%. And that's assuming that the president's use of the 1974 Act doesn't get declared unconstitutional. And because there may be challenges, just as there were challenges to his use of the 1977 Act. And so right now, the tariff effect from last year is about to reverse, and we're going to get a reduction in prices coming from a slight, teeny reduction in tariffs this year, and that will actually improve the current inflation rate.
Yeah. Let me switch gears with you. You have, I think you look at employment and unemployment a little differently because you use total. You look at the total.
Yes.
You might explain that because I think when people, they just see the headline, 4.1 or whatever, and they don't look at total, but you look at it a different way.
Yes, unfortunately, right now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they were affected by the strike, and the total depends upon the way in which we weight the various components of the labor force. How many men we have, how many women, young women, old men, immigrants coming in, going out, and so forth. And when they released the latest total employment release, they didn't adjust for the population controls for the new year. And so the current numbers, in my opinion, are nothing more than a piece of paper that are with an ill-founded foundation. And so for the time being, all we can rely on is the employment from the payroll survey. Very difficult situation, that shutdown and its consequences, but it impacts the total figure. But this is what I would say, that what we're seeing is that since January, the total immigration, the total immigrant population in the United States has fallen about 2 million people. 200,000 have been deported by law. The other 1.8 million have left voluntarily. And they're dropping off the rolls. And the immigration impact is basically made useless the weekly unemployment claims. Because as the immigrants are leaving or being laid off, whichever the case may be, or they don't collect unemployment benefits. And they're not being counted. And so the total figures, which historically are better than the payroll, are not helpful to us right now. And I'm going to do a little bit of something here that may be a stretch, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in compiling these samples, is relying on Gaussian statistics, which is the so-called bell-shaped curve, where the bulk of the observations are centered around the peak of the curve. And then you tail off to left and right side infinity. Unfortunately, we don't have normal distribution, which is what Gaussian statistics is based on. We have these increasing fat tails. And so the whole statistical approach of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is wrong. And they have to switch to Bayesian statistics, which allows for fat tails and assesses the data as it comes in and allows you to change the formatting constantly. And so we have a situation where our two most important indicators, the employment and the price numbers, consumer price index, and then, of course, the PCE, which is dependent upon it, are being used with a statistical base that we know has produced huge errors, but they're still using it. And they have to change it. And unfortunately, I don't see a process for doing that. And we're going to be in a continuing environment where one has to look to private industry data and the private sector, which is using these more advanced statistical techniques, and which are less, and in many cases, less susceptible to estimation of sample.
Is that what ADP does?
What?
ADP, is that what ADP does?
ADP system is more, yes, and in the price sector, that would be Truflation. Okay. They're using Bayesian statistics, not Gaussian. In other words, they can take the fat tails, and the Truflation measure is below 1%, and it has some capability to nowcast, in other words, tell you what you're doing now, but it has also forecasting capabilities.
Yeah. Lacy, I understand what it means, but you might, to the audience, explain what the fat tail is. I don't think they would understand that, know what that is.
Well, the fat tail would be a black swan event.
Yeah, okay. Like immigration thing or COVID or something like that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And the system just can't take it.
Yeah.
And so, and we have too many of them, and they're recurring. And then another fat tail is the fact that the Labor Department itself is a fat tail. Because over the last 2 years, when they were reporting that the labor market was resilient, that was not true.
Right.
But millions of decisions were based upon the reports from the BLS that the labor markets were good. So firms imply that this means that demand is going to be good. And it also gives the wrong signal to the Federal Reserve. Occasionally, one time, Chairman Powell did mention the error problem that the payroll numbers had. But even though they have the 400 economists that could, in my opinion, have corrected the data, they didn't use their resources to do that.
Well, I'm going to switch with you. I know you've talked a lot over the years about gross domestic income and gross domestic spending. And I think you've talked recently, there's a disconnect that would normally be. You might talk about that a bit.
One of the most important concepts in economics is the circular flow. In other words, what we spend equals what we earn. And so they're totally connected. And the great Henry Ford understood that. He was asked why he paid his workers so much. And he said, because I want them to be able to buy my cars. And it's really important right now because the circular flow is leaking. The GDP is showing a percentage point faster growth in the economy in the third quarter than gross domestic income. Moreover, we also know that the gross domestic income numbers are overstated because they were computed on the basis of the overstated payroll employment. And they've not yet been corrected. And they won't be until the summer. But anyway, we already have this gap, and there's no way to reconcile it. And so when you overstate wage and salary income, you overstate personal income, you overstate gross domestic income, and you also overstate personal and aggregate national saving. And so it's a major problem when the bureaucratic process, and people say, well, how could this happen? And I say, well, it's basically run by the same people that deliver your mail. How good is that?
That's true. But I think what you're saying for the people watching is you can't spend more than you make. Was that pretty close?
Correct.
Yeah. And we're actually showing that they are. Yeah, they're showing spending more than they make. But
that is correct.
Not really there. And you know
what's really interesting here is that all the time that the BLS was saying the labor markets were resilient month after month after month, we were seeing massive layoffs by major corporations, shutting operations. And in the retail sector, they were particularly high. So you have the press reports, and you also had the surveys of consumer sentiment by the Conference Board and by the University of Michigan. And people were saying jobs are not available. They're becoming less and less available. But yet the Labor Department is going on, and the Federal Reserve has the explanation, well, the surveys are soft data. The payroll data and the consumer price index are hard data. Well, no, they're not hard data. They're worthless data because the statistical procedures that they were used were simply faulty.
Let me ask you this. I know in switching subjects, we've been talking about the federal budget and the deficit, and I think you mentioned, I think I've seen you write this, that the tariffs were like, we had a decrease in the deficit, but the tariffs were like over 60% of that or something.
They were.
So that must mean now, I'm just asking this question, does that mean that the budget deficit goes back up again to where it would have been without it?
Well, the dollar collections, well, let's just establish some parameters here. So there's the spending side, then there's the revenue side. When the new administration came in, federal government outlays were rising at a 15% annual rate. The federal government was spending money very, very rapidly last year and the year before. And a lot of that was tied to immigration because the illegal immigrants were coming in and we had to support them. But there was other spending too. It was in the 12 months ending January, the rate of growth in federal outlays was only 2%. It was brought down very massively. And there was a very substantial layoff of government, a reduction in employment at the federal level. They were all offered buyouts back in February and March, and they took them. They went off the payrolls, and that affected it. But so you had a slowdown in government expenditures, then you had the increase in revenues. So the loss in tariff revenues will mean that will not be, it won't be very great for 2026. But the expenditures for the fiscal year that we're in, the one that started in October, if you look at the major appropriations bills, the rate of growth in spending is under 2%, which is what it was in 2025. And so the federal budget deficit, in my opinion, which was down about $400 billion for the 25 fiscal year, will remain pretty close to that level.
Same level.
Yeah. But it's still too much. I mean, it's still close to 6% of GDP. But there was an improvement at the margin.
Yeah. In supposedly good times, huh?
In very good times, and that's what's worrisome.
Yeah,
that's one of the things that I think that you will find that Kevin Wash is going to be Kevin Wash, if I understand the man, and I hope that I do, is not going to engage in a joint fiscal government policy operation like we did in COVID, which had such a disastrous impact. He's not going to do that, and he's going to not stand ready to use monetary policy to monetize the federal debt.
One of the things I was going to ask you too, that's a different subject as well, but I think everybody thinks that all of a sudden this manufacturing is coming back in the U.S. and we're growing, but in fact, capacity utilization actually, according I think to you, has probably been falling for the last few years.
It has. It fell last year. We have two developments. Number one, we're witnessing this incredible expansion in AI, in information technology, and also in software, and also in other components of manufacturing, and there the capacity utilization is rising. But if you exclude the AI and look at the legacy industries, the things that have been the bread and butter of the U.S. economy, big ticket household durables, automotive, housing, those are developing a lot of excess capacity. And so we've got a dichotomy. We've got two worlds here, and so the AI is now going to be moving into a phase where they have a tremendous amount of debt taken on, and they're going to need to show the revenues that justified the huge increase in debt. And if that doesn't happen, then there's going to be too much excess capacity in even the AI sector.
Do you think that there will be a commercial success with AI?
The question I ask myself, and I use it, is where do you get the revenue stream?
Yeah, good
now,
question.
What a lot of the companies are saying, Ted, this is such an important question you ask. What the companies are saying is they're going to be able to institute AI, and they're going to be able to reduce labor and save a lot of costs. And they're going to be able to maintain their revenue stream. Now, that may work on a company basis, but it doesn't work for the aggregate economy because it goes back to the circular flow. You have to have spending and income equal. And so if we're going to lay off all these workers because we're much more efficient, where are these folks going to have the revenue to buy all of the things that they would like to buy? In other words, are we all going to just twiddle our thumbs and rely on the government to send us transfer payments? And so to make a long story short, the AI is a wondrous technology. There's no question about it. But the issue is whether the revenues are going to be there without simultaneous job increase. If you look at the great innovations in U.S. economic history, and Robert Gordon, who wrote a book, American Economic Growth, talks about the impact of the transformation to the electric powered economy, to the combustion engine, to modern communication, modern pharmaceuticals, and also modern sanitation. The point that he made about those innovations is that they all lifted the demand for the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And this is what we're going to say here is we're going to do it with very little use of natural resources, some, which we're aware of, but not that much, and we don't need labor. So how do you equate it? And I might point out that there's one other issue here. And I recommend people to go back and look at what happened to the American economy over time. We had three highly innovative periods in which one innovation dominated for a long time. The first was in the 1830s and 40s when we used the steamboat. Marvelous innovation. And then, of course, was the building of the transcontinental railroads after the end of the American Civil War. Tremendous innovation. And then, of course, the dot-coms. Now, in all of those cases, the innovations required substantial capital investment before people could make any significant use of the new innovation. In other words, you have to build the steamship lines. You have to have the facilities for loading and unloading. The railroads, you have to build the lines. And people will use the railroads and the steamship lines and the dot-coms. And they become very profitable. And they're successful, and they have a tremendous impact. But even with their long-term success, there was substantial overinvestment in the initial phase. And so we had the panic of 1838 and 39. Van Buren was president. He had no idea what hit him. People thought because of the steamships, things should be doing so well. The same thing happened to U.S. Grant in 1873 and 75. We had the railroads, they were there, but no one was on them. They would eventually be on them. And then, of course, we all know the story of the dot-coms. And so innovation is wondrous, and it changes our life. And I no doubt that in the long run, AI will be successful. But the issue is whether that transition is smooth and whether it continues to effectuate the circular flow. And I have my doubts.
And I think you would argue that that would cause more disinflation.
It will, yes.
Because I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, all you had to do was put .com behind the name. And now you put AI behind the name and everybody wants it. And then you look up 3 years later, there's so much black fiber in the ground that, we'd never use it all. And so it's that sort of thing. And I think what you're saying is it's delayed profits. You expand, but you delay the profits.
That's correct. But by its very nature, the profits are delayed. I'll tell you, I'm just going to give you my experience with AI. If I ask a question in economic theory with the understanding of a Econ 101 student, in which the question is very imprecise, but it's a generalized sort of question, they can't get the answer right. But if I step it up and go to someone that's had intermediate economics, they get closer to the answer. And then if I use all the tools that I have with my 57 years, yeah, then I can lead them to the right answer. But I want to tell you something, the initial answers are wrong. And another thing that I've just noticed recently, and maybe it's just me, but they seem to be losing something in the response, and it's taking a longer time to get to the right answer. Yeah. But that may just be me.
So last thing I'll ask you is, because I think I know the answer to this, but do you feel like all of this coming together is going to cause more disinflation or lower inflation, and that would cause the midterm and longer term treasuries to maybe do better because rates would be coming down?
It'd be a slow process. So we had this huge surge in inflation there in 21 and 22. We got up into double digits for a while. Saw the inflation rate coming down, but we failed to understand the extreme adverse impact that it had on psychology. And I'm not happy about that. But it was similar to a lot of other circumstances. For example, if you go back to the early 80s, the yields peaked early on at close to 15% for the 30-year. And then we went down to 10, and the inflation rate was coming down very nicely, but it stalled for a while. And the 30-year backed up to 14. In other words, we were 15, we came down to 10, the inflation process slowed for a variety of different factors, and that psychology that had been scarred by the previous inflation caused a back up to 14. Eventually, that was a great buying opportunity. And I think that process is at work here. The inflation rate is coming down, particularly with the wage sector, which is 2/3 of the cost of production. Unit labor costs are only rising 1% per annum because of the productivity, in part enhanced by AI. But the process is slow. The tariffs have been at work, other factors, but I think they will, and gradually the long yields will work lower. And I think that somewhere out there, I don't have the visibility to see it now, the long bond will understand the cracks that are developing in the system.
Mm. So let me ask you, understanding what you think about lower inflation, 26, possibly 27, but in the big picture, long term, 10 years, let's say, Do you think this country has the ability to hold that inflation rate in for that long a period?
With the right economic policy, we do.
Yeah.
If um, I would recommend that Kevin Warsh did two great interview discussions that are on the Stanford Hoover um, websites, and one is inflation is a choice, and he quotes Milton Friedman, and he also quotes Paul Volcker, who was a monetarist as well as Friedman, great neoclassical thinkers, and he cites the quotation from Friedman: inflation always and everywhere is a monetary phenomenon. And it can be aggravated by hooking up with fiscal policy, which is what we did. And so even if the deficits are large and monetary policy is appropriate, I think the inflation rate can be contained. I think Kevin Warsh will do his best, and it will be a different experiment. We're on the cusp of as he said in his July interview last year with CNBC, of regime change.
Yeah. Well, listen, Lacy, as always, I appreciate all your insights. Gosh, you have so much information. We could go on for hours because you know so much more than anybody else does. But
you're too
listen,
kind, Ted. You're one of the most knowledgeable men in the investment field that I know. And, you're a great friend, and I know we have a great friendly relationship, although we always don't see eye to eye. But you're very genuine friend to have me on to express my views. So I appreciate it.
Well, listen, Lacy, thanks, and hopefully next year we can have you back again. But I appreciate you being on.
I'm glad to be on. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Best.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say, if you like this video and you want to see more of this type of information, because we really try to get the information that you don't see from anybody else, then be sure and click on subscribe, and you'll see more of what we do here at Oxbow.